Welcome to the introductory lecture on American realism. Realism emerged in reaction to Romanticism. During the period of Romanticism, authors valued extravagant emotion, compelling imagination, and the experience of solitude, particularly in nature. Readers were confronted with melodramatic stories featuring characters at the fringe of human experience. In such stories, characters went mad, had sorrowful and manic love affairs, became obsessed with revenge, and often valued solitary or even drug-induced experiences over community gatherings. In addition, many of these stories were laced with elements of the supernatural. In Young Goodman Brown, the protagonist meets the devil in the woods. In The Telltale Heart, a man's heart keeps beating after his death. In Moby Dick, Captain Ahab searches for a mythic white whale who was reported to have been sighted in different oceans at the same time. A significant number of romantic stories written by Americans even place their narratives outside of a contemporary American setting. Many of Poe's tales, for example, occurred in enchanted, otherworldly European locations. A number of Hawthorne's tales were placed into a distant Puritan past. Realism, in response, consciously sought to change each of these elements and offer a new style of story to readers who were conditioned to appreciate highly imaginative works. By the time we get to the middle of the 1800s, many readers were beginning to wonder, why did America not have a national literature that reflected its culture in the same way that other nations, such as England, had developed a national literature of their own? A quick sampling of early American fiction might lead some to believe that America was a very odd place indeed. People slept through wars. They went wandering out in the woods and met the devil, engaged in revenge murder plots, and had childhood friends who might possibly be a vampire. By the middle of the 1800s, most people living in America had either been born as Americans or had chosen freely to immigrate to the country. These individuals had a different felt sense about America than had their grandparents and great-grandparents who had lived initially in America as subjects of England. These lifelong Americans were more interested in creating a national literature that presented an accurate vision of life in America for readers overseas and preserved American contemporary culture for children and grandchildren and subsequent heirs right down to those of us living today and taking this class. That is, in part, they wanted a national literature so that we might be able to sample authentic American life of the 1800s from a vantage point far into the future. People during this period were also interested in establishing an American literature so that readers could understand the different geographic cultures that were developing in the growing country. For example, regional life in New Orleans, with its roots in Spanish and French culture, was vastly different than regional life in New York, with its roots in Dutch and English culture. Realism, at its core, is an attempt to arrange literature into a documentary art. In these novels and short stories, the underlying plots may be invented, but the settings and types of characters presented are designed to give readers a vision of an authentic contemporary America, an America that the authors have personally experienced. Realism was a mimetic art. That is, it turned away from some of the more imaginative, unrealistic elements found in Romanticism and tried to depict the types of characters and stories found in actual American settings. Like a photograph, it sought to capture American life with accurate detail. In this, realism configures a different experience for its readers than had Romanticism. The Romantics believed that the emotional experience should be the center point of literature. If you want to move readers to a heightened emotional experience, then plot, particularly unusual, intense plots, are an effective means to engage readers in secondhand vicarious experiences implicit in fiction. Edgar Allan Poe believed that poetic language and suggestive imagery were also an effective tool in engaging readers in emotional experiences. For these reasons, the craft emphasis areas in Romantic literature are often structured around plot and, for Poe, poetic language, far more so than other areas such as characterization, dialogue, and humor. But the political aims of realism are to deliver a documentary-like experience to readers through literature. Plot, of course, is essential to all stories. But if the ultimate goal is to present and commemorate American culture, then the relative importance of plot will decrease. In its place, other areas will increase. And what craft areas in fiction might be more important to present and preserve culture? Well, the presentation of characters is one of those areas. Culture means, essentially, people and the lives that they lead. So these stories will have an increased importance on character development. Likewise, if the realists want to preserve the importance of America as a country and as a place, these writers will emphasize setting far more than the romantics. In particular, the realist will be interested in how a place defines culture for the individual in the 1800s in America. Or to put this another way, the ultimate goals of an aesthetic often determine how fiction will configure craft elements to meet those goals. For the Romantics interested in the emotional expansiveness of art, plot was a far more effective tool to meet those ends than characterization. For the realist, however, characterization and setting have a new importance in presenting and preserving life in America as fiction moves into the second half of the 19th century. For our class, I'll place realism as the defining American aesthetic from 1865 to 1910. For writers of fiction during this period, Romanticism was often seen as a period of experimentation in which writers explored how elements of poetry and nonfiction might be configured with concepts borrowed from stage dramas and overseas novels into a type of new literature. But realism is a conscious aesthetic in which writers and editors work together to create a national aesthetic for literature that they feel is superior to Romanticism. In this, fiction in America begins to fall clearly into two categories. There is literature, which is considered an artistic exploration of human experience, and there is entertainment, which includes stories designed to amuse. In contemporary times, we do the exact same thing. We divide films into similar categories. There are serious or art house films, which explore culture and win Oscars and other awards, and there are summer blockbusters, which are designed almost wholly to entertain. Both of these two storytelling styles existed in the late 1800s. One was art, and the other was not. For those authors wishing to create art, editors developed essentially a litmus test to determine what was art and what wasn't. And here is essentially the list that separates art from entertainment in the late 1800s. First, to be considered literature, a story must be set in a region where the author has lived for a significant period of time. Unlike Poe's stories, which were often set in Gothic Europe, or Hawthorne's tales set in the distant past, most American writers of realism set their fiction in the America of their day. Most writers were associated with one region of the country, and only one. For example, Jack London was associated with the Far West and the Yukon Territory. Kate Chopin was associated with the Creole culture of New Orleans. Mary Wilkins Freeman was associated with rural New England, and so on. If a story is going to have a social documentary component, then the author needs to be a person who is an expert about the region in which he or she writes. Second, the story must be set within the writer's lifetime. It doesn't need to be set in the year in which the writer is writing, but it can be. For example, Kate Chopin writes her most famous novel, The Awakening, in the late 1890s. The novel is set more or less during the same time. However, Mark Twain wrote Huck Finn in the 1870s and 1880s. It took him many years and many attempts to finish that novel. Yet the novel is set before the Civil War in the 1840s. Mark Twain was born in 1835, and so would have been the same age more or less as Huck and Tom in the late 1840s. The novel, therefore, is set within his lifetime, but more importantly, it follows a boy narrator through the years when the author would have been a boy himself. In this way, Mark Twain not only has a unique insight into the period, but also a boy's perspective on that period in the region where Twain himself had lived. So the first two elements on this list define the setting and time frame of the novel in direct relationship to the setting and time frame of the author's life. Third, realism is going to embrace the concept of regionalism. Today, American cities have a homogeneity to them. They're all the same. I can wake up in any Marriott's, click on CNN, then wander down to the lobby and order a Starbucks without really knowing whether I'm in Boston or San Francisco. But in the late 1800s, America was filled with diverse cultures that were often defined by region. Today, authors of novels are branded by genre. If you pick up a Stephen King novel, you can expect to find a scary supernatural thriller. If you pick up a John Grisham novel, you can expect to find a story of legal intrigue. In the late 1800s, however, many writers became associated with distinct regions of the country, such as Sarah Owen Jewett, who became a writer of New England culture, and Mark Twain, who became a writer of the Mississippi River Basin, and Bret Harte, who became a writer of the Wild West, and so on. This type of branding was so strong and resonated so deeply with readers that some writers couldn't escape writing about the region of which they were most associated. The author Kate Chopin, for example, grew up in St. Louis and later moved with her husband to Louisiana. When she started writing, her name was so closely associated with the culture of Louisiana that even after she returned home to St. Louis in her later years, she had trouble selling stories that weren't set in Louisiana, as part of her public identity was so deeply invested with the presentation of Louisiana culture. These authors were, in essence, representatives of their regional culture. In recent decades, we've seen a similar arrangement in American literature called multiculturalism. Writers under the banner of multiculturalism don't represent a region so much as the culture of ethnic or religious experience or the culture of sexual and gender identity. Authors such as Amy Tan translate ethnic experience, in this case, the experience of Chinese Americans, for a wide readership. Likewise, authors such as David Levitt translate the experience of gay men similarly for a wide readership. In their work, the experience of a specific group is arranged so that an audience outside of that group can see the internal tensions often experienced by members inside the group. This underlying principle, more or less, also defines regionalism. Kate Chopin is presenting fiction set in New Orleans and other Louisiana cities so that readers in other parts of the country can understand the uniqueness of Creole life. Mark Twain is presenting the conflicts, beauty, and prejudice of the Mississippi River Basin in such a way that readers outside the region can understand them. Number 4. The middle class. By the mid-1800s, many middle-class readers have begun to wonder why there aren't more characters like them in American fiction. The response to this pressure was both political and economic. From an economic standpoint, during the second half of the 19th century, many middle-class Americans began to accumulate enough wealth to allow them more time for cultural experiences and entertainment. Through this and through expanded schooling, America began to develop a new type of readership. Most middle and upper-class Americans read a good deal of fiction both in magazines and books. Because of this, the shape of American fiction began to change as well. Readers wanted to see more characters like themselves in terms of class standing, and writers responded in part to expand their readership. Short stories began to present characters very much like the readers who actually read them. The short story, The Revolt of Mother by Mary Wilkins Freeman, for example, depicted the wife in an average New England farming family and was published in a magazine that was sold primarily to middle-class women readers. In The Rise of Silas Lapham, author William Dean Howells chronicled the life of an average Bostonian businessman. But the inclusion of a wider range of characters also contained a political element as well. If American fiction was, in part, to present a documentary-like vision of American culture, it needed to include a far wider panoply of class to present the varieties of American experience, from the poor to the middle class to the upper class. Lastly, number 5, realism presents a new understanding of what it means to be human. During the Romantic period, people were often depicted as emotional, imaginative, and spiritual beings. But after the influence of Charles Darwin, people were again depicted largely as physical beings. Elements of expansive emotion, imagination, and spiritualism were still present, though were de-emphasized as literature instead sought to explore how individuals connected in realistic ways to the culture and the land around them. As we move into the fiction for this unit, take some time to notice how the political demands of realism incentivize writers to place more emphasis on setting, characters, and a cultural range of characters' lives, at least in terms of class. We are at the beginning of the story of the diversification of American literature. It begins with class and then moves to gender, and then in the 20th century, race, religion, and concerns of identity. But here in the late 1800s, we are at the very beginning of that cultural and artistic story.